First of all, I want to thank the director and thank Venerable Karna Ketup and for inviting me, and thank all of you for coming. It's an enormous privilege to be in a place as interesting and unusual and packed with things to see and things to try to understand. I mean, you know that I'm a foreigner. I don't understand Tibet. I don't understand Buddhism. I don't understand your language. I would like to know more about all of that. And so in the last, it's only now the third day that I've been here, we've just been soaking in everything we can see about how interesting this place is. Dharamshala, Tibet in exile, but also this particular place, well, maybe just up the hill, the library and an archive. And I will come back at the end of my presentation to an appreciation of all that you have achieved here. I just wanted to, if I can break away from my slide just one moment and skip ahead to one picture. Okay, that is where I started. I first saw a deck like that, much older than that, in about 1955, when I was about 9 years old in school. And the school had a much older deck like that in the school's audiovisual department. This was in Wisconsin, in the middle of America, where I was growing up. And I was fascinated. I wasn't allowed to touch it. You had to be in the upper school, and then you could be in the audiovisual club, and then you could help use the equipment, the film projector and the audio recorder. No video equipment back in 1955 or 1956. In 1959, my family, my mother, pulled together enough money that she actually bought me my own tape recorder in 1959. So I had a little portable battery-operated tape recorder in 1959, which I tried to use, but I couldn't really afford the batteries, so I didn't use it a whole lot. And then various things changed, and and that tape recorder was, well, it became obsolete quite quickly. I went to university. In 1964, I entered university, and the university had acquired its first computer. So the university, which had about 4,000 students, had one computer. This was an achievement back in 1964. So in 1965, I wrote my first computer program. So I can say that I've been writing computer programs for more than 50 years, which it might not make me an expert, but it certainly means I've been working at it for a very long time. I'm really going over these things because I know that you've had an excellent introduction, very complimentary from Venerable Karma Ketup, but still I could be anybody, and why should you listen to me? So I'm not going to try to tell you how great I am or how smart I am, but I will try to tell you that I have had a lot of experience, because then I finished university, and in 1967 I got a job in a speech processing laboratory that dealt with technology for speech radios and government communications. And that was 1967. Everything was analog, but my first boss had been on a summer course talking about digital audio and digital processing. So I started working in digital audio in 1967, which also is a very long time ago, and much longer than most people in the archive world who have been using analog audio up until maybe 15 years ago, and switching to digital when they switched to DAT or CD, or to having WAV files on their computer, or having an MP3 player. That is the revolution of the last 20 years. But I was ready for it and feel comfortable with it because I was using digital audio and the replacements to these going back to 1967. Okay, so that's my justification for why I feel I can at least claim a background, if not enormous expertise. I can certainly claim a background. I want to talk about the significance of audio and video and film recording. Actually, I haven't been to Pathankot because our train was canceled. We had to fly in the end. But I expect to get to Pathankot, and of course, and I say with all humility, the whole Tibetan community is on an enormous and very difficult journey. But I'm going to talk about the journey of imagery and moving images and audio. This is the first kind of a photograph. This is about 1835. That's Louis Daguerre, and that's his daguerreotype photograph. This is the second type of photograph developed in England. Louis Daguerre was in France. This photograph looks pretty similar, but you could make prints. With the daguerreotype, there was only the one. It was the thing that was exposed in the camera, and then that was it. You could carry it around and show it to people, but that's all you could do. With the calotype, you could make prints, and then you could, a little bit like publishing, and that was a breakthrough because it's one thing to record, and it's another thing to make copies. This is a very early recording of sound. You could take the carbon, the black material you would get from a lamp chimney, like well, even if you put glass by a butter lamp in the temple, you can get black smoke on the glass. And then with sound pressure hitting a drum and the right kind of mechanics, you can scratch the black carbon and make this impression. This was 1857. This is before the phonograph by 30 years. And this is another important thing about audio. You could make a visible impression of sound, but this couldn't be played back. How can you play back a scratch in some carbon on a piece of glass? This could be photographed, this could be printed in books, this was a big step forward, but it didn't reproduce. That took Edison, Thomas Edison from the United States, and this is about 1888, so we are still in the 19th century, and he had a mechanism that would scratch into foil, very thin metal, and then if you put a needle on the thin metal, the needle would move. That could be connected to another diaphragm, like a little drum, and it would go through a big horn, and if it all worked properly, you could listen in the horn and see what was on the disc. This was recording and playback, which became important in cultural heritage because then disappearing cultures could be recorded. This is American Indian culture being recorded by a very early anthropologist around about 1895. Moving images were then developed also. Kodak developed film that wasn't just a plate, but film that was on a roll. Once there was film on a roll, other people said, well, if we could just take the pictures faster, we could get moving images or the impression of moving images. And the Lumière brothers in France worked on this, and many, many people worked on this, and Edison worked on this. Edison developed a way to project these images, and that was the beginning of cinema. So we had sound recording, phonograph, film, cinema, all developed before 1900, but really just before 1900, and really revolutionizing the world, because before around about 1890, 1900, there was no record of what had happened other than you could write it down or you could draw a picture, but you couldn't hear it and you couldn't see it as it was, and you certainly couldn't see it moving and walking and talking until these inventions, which were then followed very quickly by broadcasting. And radio started just after 1900. The BBC started in 1922. People were working on television in the 1920s, a variety of people working on television in the 1920s. You see the plaque there, 1926 in London for a first demonstration of television. And then the BBC began broadcasting television in 1932. I know many other areas, television came much later, in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. But radio came to many, many places between the First War and the Second War, in the 1920s and the 1930s. And the combination of audio recording and radio meant not only could something be recorded and preserved, but it then also could be spread over great distances. And we had the director saying, we can get our message out, and we can get our message out immediately. Broadcasting was central to that idea that you could get a message out immediately. Recording was central to keeping it, and broadcasting was central to accessing it. This technology was new. The world was not like that before this technology. Video, unfortunately, started with, I just wonder, I have an amazing device here, and I'm not sure if I can remember how to turn it on. Okay, video started with 2-inch tape, and this doesn't really show the size, but 2-inch tape was kind of that size, and you had to get sort of lifting instructions if you're going to carry it, so you wouldn't do your back in. And it was very, very expensive. This tape was the price of a small car in 1960. And the player that you played it on was the price of a small house. When people ask, why didn't the BBC archive save all these programs from the 1950s and the 1960s, part of the answer was original videotape was enormously expensive, and it never went to the archive. You recorded a program on the tape, you transmitted it, maybe a week later you transmitted it again. That was good for the BBC, because before that in the BBC, if you wanted to show something like a drama 2 times to have a presentation and a repeat, it was just like the theater. You brought the cast back in and they did it again. And that was quite complicated and expensive. So videotape was useful but extremely expensive, and there was no archive. The BBC had videotape in 1960. The BBC had a videotape archive in 1972. So because of the expense and because the way it was used, and because people didn't understand the value, you know, we are broadcasting. Broadcasting is very much in the moment. So things weren't put into archives. My first, not my direct boss, but my boss's boss in the BBC in 1994 founded the BBC archive. And she did it in the way librarians have always done it. She had to be a very strong person and a very good communicator to go around to all the bits of the BBC and convince them of the need to keep things and use things and reuse things, to convince them of the importance of the archive. After 2-inch, there's 1-inch, then there's U-matic. This was domestic formats, 1/2-inch. VHS had a big fight with Betacam and VHS-1. And then there were professional formats that you probably wouldn't have seen, D2 and D3. Digital Betacam, Betamax fought with VHS. There it is. This was the loser, this was the winner. Video 8, which was 1/8-inch tape. Then you get into DV formats, mini DV. All of these are different kinds of videotape. Most of them had a usage life in the BBC or even wherever of a few years. About 10 years after 2 inch comes 1 inch. About 10 years after 1 inch comes 3/4 inch. Then comes Betacam. Then comes digital Betacam. Then comes DVC Pro. Fast, fast, fast like that. This is very awkward for video. Fortunately, you don't have so much video of these older formats, I believe, here in the Tibetan archive, because this is a major problem for the video side. On the audio side, you have the 1/4 inch tape, as I showed you, a couple of different sorts of gramophone discs, shellac and vinyl, and that's about it for the older formats. If you really have an old collection, you may go all the way back to the time of Edison and have wax cylinders. But that's rare, and if you have those, then you have a very special problem. Audiovisual material is made, it's used. As I said, it took about 10 years for the BBC to think you could also keep it, not just use it. Film material is not just used in cinema, but in many other, everything from industry to medicine was using film. Broadcasting obviously uses all of this material. And then there's these collections. Here we have a heritage and library in the LTWA. But there are many, many commercial uses, again, uses in medicine, academic uses. We saw the photograph of the anthropologist making a recording of a Native American Indian. In one American university that seriously started to look at their collections, this was a university that has a famous music school. They have a very good school of radio and broadcasting training. But then they have all sorts of other things, like a sports department that has videos of their basketball games. And just all around the university, they did an inventory, and they found 500,000 items in this one university in Indiana, in the United States. So there are a huge range of collections outside broadcasting. We did a study along with a bunch of other European archives. We got answers from about 400 collections, and these were the results. The broadcast archives are the biggest, but there aren't that many broadcasters. Small and specialist collections. This is where you come in. Small and specialist collections are more important than anything else in the total. Also have more of a problem. Broadcasters, national collections, major collections typically have or can hope to have a budget for operation and preservation of this material. Small and specialist collections are often desperate for funding. They often exist because a particular person, a particular professor, a particular historian, a particular writer, a particular musician has made a collection, a particular small library has made a collection, and nobody has given them money to run this collection year after year after year, and they have to find some way to get funding. So these collections, 40% of the total, are also collections that have often very difficult budget problems. How much material? I led a study in 2001, 2002 of 10 European broadcast archives, and we found 5 million hours. That wasn't hard to find. The BBC had 1 million. There's a big broadcast, a national broadcast archive in France. There's a national broadcast archive in the Netherlands. There's a big broadcaster in Italy, big broadcaster in Austria. And then we had about 10 major broadcasters in Germany, and added all of that up along with Norway and Sweden, and we got this 5 million hours, but that's 5 million hours in 10 broadcasters. We then did another study, and we tried to get to as many collections as we could, and we couldn't really reach the small ones, but we found a total of 10 million hours in about 30, essentially broadcast and major archives. A project called TAPE had the 400 small archives, and they found another 20 million hours. This is still in Europe. These are 20 million hours. How long does that take? If you work full time for a year, maybe you have very long working days here, but in Europe, a working year would be about 2,000 hours. So then if you work for 50 years listening as your job, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, it would take you 50 years to listen to 1 million hours. So this is a huge amount of material. Every million is a lifetime of listening. UNESCO looked at my numbers, and I think basically they added a 0. You could ask Dietrich Schuler how he got this number, but I think he took my number and added a 0, because how do you get a real number for what it is worldwide? Okay, so you could have two responses. You could say, oh, that's a big number, but what my message today is, oh, that's a big problem. It's a wonderful resource as long as it lasts. And these are some of the things that people do, and you could write this list yourself, what it's good for. There are people that don't have audiovisual collections and don't much care about audiovisual collections who would need to be shown this list. But I think most of you already know that you have content of value if you have something that says how it sounded and how it looked. I wanted to try to imagine if we had had television and radio and gramophone and recorded music in previous centuries. I don't know if you watch Meet the Kardashians. I hope not, but if you do, what if you had Meet the Moguls? I don't know if you had Big Brother, but what if you had Big Brother from 500 years ago, where they're not locked in a room, they're locked in a plague city? I don't really know who this princess is, but I believe this was the princess who was meant to have maybe brought Buddhism to Tibet. I don't know. Anyway, this is a historical princess, but she could have been a real person. I think she was a real person. I think she did come and become a bride of one of your first Tibetan emperors. And if they had had television, they would have put her on a talk show and said, you've come a long way, how you like it so far, or something like that. And we don't have that. And being more serious, we don't have what you have put together about the current Dalai Lama. We don't have this. And you have a longer history of Dalai Lama, going back 300 to 400 years. You have a longer history than most people. And if you had those ceremonies from the beginning, well, you could have if you had had some videotape and some audio tape. I don't actually know who that is either, but I guess that was popular music in Tibet 100 years ago. BBC studio session. What's a BBC studio session? People like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, before they were big, often came into the BBC first. And a famous disc jockey, there were a whole range of them, would bring them in the studio. Hello, how are you? You cut your first record. How are you getting on? Can you play something for us? And that's what BBC studio sessions are. Wonderful things, often very early on in the careers of people who sometimes then never went anywhere and sometimes became extraordinarily famous. We don't have that kind of intimate recording until the 20th century. And this is why it's a problem. It is all at risk, all of it. Every last item. If it is sitting on a shelf, and if it's audio or video or film, it's at risk. Why? It's fragile, it can deteriorate, and most of all, especially for video, the players become obsolete. 70% of the content, and this was something that I was putting together several years ago. I think the figure I would have to say is higher now. And we have a short lifespan. That tape recorder that I showed you, nobody makes those anymore. Hardly any source of spare parts except to find old machines and steal the parts from other machines. So this situation is only going to get worse. Here is an obsolete audio player. That is a wax disc. This is a beautiful machine. This is from Denmark. Very, very beautiful machine, but completely obsolete. If you have an important recording, you have to get it off that wax cylinder. And that applies to everything else. You just have to get it off. This is deterioration, very, very typical for film. Also, very importantly, film like that can be changed to film like that using digital signal processing, which is what I did my PhD in, although I didn't do it in video, I did it in audio. So digitizing has many purposes. It preserves, it allows you to do restoration, and then it provides you with access, even leading to internet access. So that's why I'm coming up to the message about digitization. We would get junior librarians in the BBC who had never seen a disc, although there is a resurgence. Now there is a kind of a rebirth in vinyl, but this is not vinyl. And I guess you would realize, I don't know how many, some of the younger people here have maybe never seen these, but this was before vinyl. Vinyl came out in the mid-1955, around 1955. The first recording by Elvis Presley was on this kind of a disc. Hound Dog, 1954, on a shellac disc. And you drop a shellac disc and this is what you get. Vinyl would bounce. Vinyl would also bend. If you leave vinyl in the back of in a hot window with the sun coming through the glass, the vinyl could bend and distort. So there are problems with vinyl, but this is shellac. We just developed a way, and anybody could do this, we developed a way in the BBC to try to recover sound from discs like this. And you would put it, we would put protective paper on a turntable and put these pieces on a turntable. And then there's a kind of clay that I think of as being something that held the British Empire together. It's called blue tack. And every British household uses blue tack to hold things up and to hold things together. So this kind of sticky clay we would put around the pieces to hold it together as tightly as possible. And then we could play it, but it would go click, 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 click. Every time it hit one of these pieces, it would click. And then we would do basically the audio version of this. We would do cleanup, which could be done it could be done by a computer program. You can find the clicks, and pretty much you can take the clicks out. You de-click. So we would put it together with blue tack and de-click it, and you can get sound from that, providing you have all the pieces. Again, this is tape that has dried out, and you put it on a player, and the part where the recording actually exists simply slides off from the plastic backing, and all you're left with is a pile of what looks like wood shavings. That you cannot recover from, and that's damage. This is chemical damage to film. This is another example, and this is another example. This is probably acetic acid of damage. This is what happens to material. And this is also what happens. This is obsolescence. This is the old 2-inch player. This is a BBC picture. We were very proud. You can see the kind of idea that this is as valuable as a car, because you advertise it that way. 1-inch format, gone. I think this is Beta SP. Anyway, these formats, they're all just gone. If you can find a machine like this, it's then an enormously complicated job to get it working. And the people who understood these machines, you know, spent 20 years with them, but those people are my age or older. And so many of them are gone too. That's the problem. I'm jumping ahead a bit, but really digitizing this material is what you have to do to save it. Keeping it on the shelves will just hit the obsolescence problem if you're not hitting the deterioration problem. If you're digitizing at 1 or 2% per year, then that means you will finish your digitizing in 50 or 80 years, and 50 or 80 years is far too long. I would advise people to be digitizing 10% of their collection every year if you possibly can, and a minimum of 5% if you can't make 10. At least do whatever you can to do 5%, because if you do 5% this year, you will get to the end in 20 years. 20 years is just about believable, especially if you deal with the hardest to do material first and get through. But if you're dealing at less than 5% a year, time will run out, and something like 50 to 70% of content will be lost. I can see from what I've already seen of the Tibetan archive here, LTWA, that you've been doing this work, and you've been doing this work for 15 years. And I don't know how far through you are, but you know, you are not in this position that many other collections are. But if you have a collection that you're not digitizing, then you must, I say, you must. You'll be in desperate trouble if you don't make a 10-year plan and do as much as you can in the next 10 years, because the next 10 years are critical. Try to finish it in the next 10 years, definitely in the next 20. So, why not just conserve? And it's because of the obsolescence, really. If you take audio tape and put it in cold storage for 10 years, then finding audio tape players in 10 years' time is going to be much more expensive than it is today, and it's already difficult enough today. So conserving is what film collections do, because film collections, they have projectors, they intend to keep the projectors running themselves, although I think we will find, and I'm here, I know I'm in Tibet now in a way, but I'm here in India for a film preservation conference in Pune, and I will find more next week about exactly what they are doing. But film collections, every film collection that I've been to, they say, we love film, we keep film, we want film to last forever. And now let me show you this DVD we made from a digitized film. Because they are digitizing, because you have to digitize, because otherwise the only access you have is when people come to your 1 or 2 cinemas in a whole nation. In the UK, we have the British Film Institute. They have a very lovely cinema in London. They show film every day, but that's only a fragment of the whole population that is accessing film through the internet and through DVDs, not through analog. Vinyl, I want to find more about what has happened to vinyl, because in Europe, vinyl was dead 20 years ago, and it has come back from the grave, and vinyl is being issued as new recordings, and people are buying turntables. So vinyl has come back in Europe, but I don't know what's happening in other parts of the world. But still it's fragile. Okay, you drop it and it doesn't break, but every time you put a needle on a vinyl record, you risk damaging it. And if it isn't a very good needle on a very good turntable, you can damage the grooves. And in fact, even when you're very careful, you do slight amounts of damage, because if you play a record 50 times, it doesn't sound as good as a record that has only been played once. So every playback is a small amount of damage. When you play back a file on your mobile device, you don't damage it. You can play it back forever. So there is an absolute difference between the digital world and the analog world. If you're going to digitize, well, I was speaking to an archive down in Delhi, and they said that they had spoken to you and said, how are you digitizing? And the answer they heard was, very carefully. And of course, you have to do it very carefully. But if you have a lot of content and a short time, you have to do it very efficiently. And by efficient, I mean the person that's doing it has to do as much as they can in the day. And if you have several people, then you try to organize a whole team that is as efficient as possible. And I'll show you our BBC. This is our BBC preservation factory. We had about, I'm trying to remember her name. Oh dear, because this photograph goes back about 15 years, and I'm sorry. I think it was Tracy. Anyway, she is running this machine and this machine and a machine there and a machine there. Next to her is another person who's running that machine and two more machines that you can't see. And we had about 6 people. Each of them had 4 machines, and so that was our factory. But we were one of the biggest collections of radio anywhere. We had 300,000 hours to get through. So we had this system of one person working very efficiently and doing 4 tapes at once. Many other archives are now doing this. But if you're very small, then this doesn't make sense. But there were other things. She didn't get up from that chair and go and get tapes. Tapes were brought to her. The tapes that were brought to her had already been checked by somebody else to see if their catalog information was correct with the barcode that was on the tape. So she didn't check the catalog. She didn't correct the catalog. She didn't burn the CD afterwards. We were still making CDs later. So we had division of labor. And even if you're a small archive, you can try to maximize the efficiency of your division of labor. So the person who is really good at running these machines runs those machines as much of the working day as possible and isn't interrupted and isn't stopped by this problem or that problem, or having to go and get things, or having to label the boxes, or any of these other things that get in the way. If you have the whole job done by one person, you get less efficiency. So it's much better if you can organize a team and one person is doing metadata, somebody else is doing the audio engineering. If there was a problem on a tape, she took that tape off and put it in the problem box and put a new tape on and kept going. So this is like somebody running a race and they lose a shoe. You get a new shoe and you keep going. You know, you just keep going. Her job, and they only did a 4-hour shift because 8 hours I think would be, well, some people could do it, but most people couldn't. So they're just doing copying of audio tape 4 at a time for 4 hours intensely and getting as much hours through that process as they possibly could. And we called this the preservation factory. And very well-known people in the audio world were saying, oh, well, it's okay, broadcasters can do that, all your material is high quality, it's all the same format. We are a specialist archive, we have many different formats. 15 years ago, this was seen as arguable or even wrong by some people. Now this is standard, and most archives and most bodies that have sizable amounts of material are using this approach because you can still get good quality. You just have to have it properly organized. Now, I don't want to go too far into the engineering. I think we'll have a tea break in about a half an hour, is it? We will have tea in about a half an hour?
Yes.
Okay, so after the tea break, I would like to have discussion and to go on to any specific questions, but I'm not sure how many people in the room have technical issues, how many people in the room have general policy issues, how many want to know about a strategy for preservation, how many want to know about access, and how many want to know about engineering. I would love to talk about the engineering. I am an engineer. This is what I do. But just for now, I will just say that there is a very well accepted standard for audio. And this is what everybody who is trying to save audio, including of course here at LTWA, this is what they're doing. So 48 standard, 96 kilohertz sampling rate if possible, so-called 24 bits, saved without compression as a WAV file. If any of you are thinking or are being pushed to say, ah, well, you've got audio, you should make MP3 because that's small files and easy to store, then you must point to this and say, no, no MP3, no MP3 here, MP3 out, because that's compression. And if you're an archive, you're thinking of forever. And the only way to think properly of forever is you want to save without losing anything. Now, I'm not sure if a word like compression, but compression is how you make an MP3 file. And something is thrown away. They try to throw away what you can't hear, but they are throwing something away. So a file that would be, well, like a CD is about 700 megabytes for 1 hour. You could get all of that on MP3 in about 100 megabytes. If people are telling you, go for the 100 megabytes, forget about the 700 megabytes, you have to say no. And this is the standard that would back you up. You say no because that would be losing things, that would be throwing things away. And your principle as an archivist, if you are an archivist, and your principle as an engineer is that you save the quality. That's what you fight for. We've mentioned some of these problems. I have some technical slides which I think I'll just whiz through. I was very envious when I was at a workshop in Colombia, in Bogota, Colombia, and I was talking about policy about broadcasting and policy about access and rights and broadcasting versus the internet. And somebody else at the archive, at the workshop, just had the people at the local company bring out a tape deck, and she spent 3 hours just doing basic engineering on this tape deck. She tested its, you have things that adjust tension there or there. You have brakes so that when it spins, it comes back and stops. There are things about the heads. There's a whole bunch of technical issues that, so she just did a basic overhaul and setup and calibration of a tape deck. And the people there thought that was lovely because it was practical. And I think some of them were sleeping while I was giving my presentation. So I was jealous, but I'm an engineer too. So I could go through those things about a tape deck. I'll just show some of the complexities. If nothing else, this would help you appreciate what the group here with Karma Ketup has already faced and solved. Because there are a whole range of speeds. When you get a tape off a shelf, you don't necessarily know what speed it is. So there's the whole range of speeds. There's the whole range of tracks, mono, stereo, 2-track, 4-track. The tracks can be arranged on the tape in various ways. And you have to, you have to be kind of a detective and you find these things out. You have to have a 2-track and ideally a 4-track deck so that you can test because the box might not tell you. And you can record both tracks at once going that way. Typically what you did in the early days before we had stereo was you recorded it going one way and then the tape was full and then you turned the tape over and swapped reels and you recorded it going the other way. And you have to find out these things. Otherwise your playback is just going to be completely screwed up. You have to have the right head to fit the right kind of tape format. And then there are all the issues about what I showed about sticky shed. This is business. So you have to cope with the condition of your tape so that you don't have that happening. You can bake tapes, but you have to test the condition, know that it's okay. If you've done that to your tape, you've already ruined it. So you have to know what you're dealing with and if necessary, bake the tape, put it at a high temperature and then it, the moisture that has gone into it comes out of it and it lubricates again. And then there's this mysterious thing called azimuth. And you would know about azimuth and you would set azimuth. If you are using a 1/4-inch tape deck, this kind of, if you're using this kind of deck, you have to know about azimuth if you're going to make an archive quality playback. Because if the tape is moving like that and it moves over the head, well, really the head is more like that. If the head is bent, you can think about this as far as geometry, but if the head is bent, then the very highest frequency wiggles aren't able to be seen by the head, and you lose the high frequency. And if you have better hearing than mine, and you're playing something like a high frequency tone, up there, and you bend the azimuth, you can go, when it's on, it's loud, and if you turn it sideways, so it goes, it's that kind of a thing, and you use the tool. The problem is you probably don't have a tape that has a high frequency tone, so you have to listen for high frequencies yourself and just make a judgment about, okay, this is, I think in this setting I'm getting the highest frequencies. When I spoke to the British Library Sound Archive, they said for every single playback, they adjust the azimuth because these tapes come from here, there, and elsewhere. So this is the kind of technical detail that we could talk about more later. It's crucial to archive preservation, but this gets into the engineering. And I don't know how many of you have that kind of an issue, or how many of you more have a collection or a policy or a funding or a cataloging issue. You also have to clean your heads, and you have to demagnetize your heads. I can't now buy a demagnetizer in the United Kingdom. I can only import them from the USA. And when I went to Cambodia, they had never heard of a head demagnetizer, so I took them one. Again, these are things that well, I do have a message here. My message is the playback of audio and video recordings is a specialist subject where you need expertise. They have developed this expertise for audio here at LTWA. I hope that they will give advice to any of the rest of you who have to play back audio tape, because to have to cope with all of this yourself as a non-specialist is very difficult, and it would be much better to refer to people who already know about all these things. Again, I don't know how much you can see in this picture, but this should be smooth. And over here, there's a kind of a scratch down there and a scratch down there. So these heads need replacing. But if you haven't looked at 100 heads in your career as an audio technician, you don't know a good head from a bad head. Of course, the next problem you're going to have is if you want to replace a head, there's may well be nowhere that you can buy one. And then you have to try to scavenge. So these are difficult technical issues, and for me the moral is the solution to all these technical issues is to speak to an expert. And you have an expert, you have a group of 4 experts here at LTWA. Audio, you've seen some of the complexities of audio. Video is much, much, much harder. And you really can't do video by yourself. So I don't even think I want to go into these issues, but if there are people who have a real video question afterwards, then we will go into these issues. I don't know if this would look like complete rubbish or foreign language or what this would look like. This is the recipe for what you do with video, but it's not going to make sense unless you have a background in video. And you're not going to be able to do it professionally without a lot of professional equipment, not just the player. You need other equipment also. I don't know if you have film, and I don't want to say much about film. I'll learn more down in Pune at the conference, the 10-day conference on film preservation, more about the situation in India and how it applies to Tibet. But for web access and for restoration, as I said, you still need to digitize. So I think people will be digitizing film. The problem with digitizing film is the expense. The machinery is very expensive. The company that makes the best film digitizer is a company based in Germany, but they're now owned by Prasad, the big Indian film company. So India is becoming the top of the technology for film work. And you will have expertise to call upon, but you wouldn't digitize your own film. You'd have to give them money, and that's going to be the problem. I just want to talk about a little bit about digital. Because I was saying digitization is the answer, and digitization is the answer to obsolescence, deterioration, fragile media. But if any of you have ever had a computer crash, if any of you have ever had a memory card that had a failure, if ever you've had a memory stick that had a failure, if you've ever lost a file because it got renamed or this or that or the other, then you know that digital has its own problems. For those of you who are librarians, you may have seen something called OAIS. I didn't actually put it on there. But there is there's a kind of a formal strategy, open archive information system, and the library world has developed this. Essentially, they developed it originally for thinking about preserving files in general. And it's very complicated, and I don't know how much applies, certainly not to broadcasting. It all started with packages, and the whole idea was if you're going to hold files forever, then when the file comes in, it's not just the file, it's a package that tells you how the file is played, what the metadata is, what the rights are, any special conditions. The whole package has to come in. Then it can go into archive storage as an archive package. And then if somebody wants to access it, you get a delivery package. And there are standards and standards and standards about this. This is what librarians talk about. And if you want to talk about OAIS, I can say a little about it. But this is what I like to talk about, which is how engineers look at preservation. I said 2. 3 is better, 4 is better, 5 is better, 6 is better, 7 is better. Where do you stop? This is why an engineer says, okay, how much better, how much does it cost? You want numbers. To me, until you come down to the numbers, you're not really talking about anything that you can make a decision on. You're just talking about opinions. But the minimum number is 2. Because somehow, somewhere in the future, something will happen to one of them. The worst possible thing that could happen is that something happens to both of them simultaneously, but that's why 3 is better than 2, of course. But what you expect is that one has a problem. The real issue, and we just have this little word here, and you maybe don't make much of it. This is the key. How do you know that a file is corrupted or lost? It doesn't tell you. You know, when I turn my computer on, I'm not going to get a message that says, way down in some file, in some folder, on some storage device, suddenly a file is bad that wasn't bad before, or whatever. You have to go and look for these problems. And you have to do it by having a process that examines all of your content on a regular basis. And most people don't have this process. And that's why people then have failures and say, oh God, I lost, a whole drive or whatever. You need a process that examines your files. If you detect the problem when only one has been corrupted, then you can go back here. And you can look at the good copy, you can make a second copy, and then you go back here, and then you're happy. So this is where you live. Something happens, you have to detect it, then you can go back here. If you don't detect it, then eventually you're there. And so this is the engineering thing. And I've worked with a company at University of Southampton. They've now formed a commercial company called Archivum. They base all their statistics on this kind of a model, and they are now a storage provider for major archives, British Library, Museum of Modern Art, Tate Galleries, and a string of other people in the university sector. They provide storage based on this model of they can prevent this happening by doing this often enough. So they know the failure rate of their storage devices. They use LTO tape with disk for access. And they run the numbers, and based on their numbers, if you deposit material with them, if you deposit material with something like Amazon and they lose it, they won't pay you any money at all. This company will pay you money if they lose it. And if you tell them that your files are worth 10,000 British pounds sterling each, they will write a contract so that they will pay you 10,000 pounds British sterling if they lose a file. They will charge you in proportion to that, but they've got the numbers, and that's why I say it's all a matter of numbers. So this is digital preservation. You can get open source software that will run on a laptop and check all the files that you want it to point to. So I have that running at home. I have network attached storage at home. I just now have it running on about 30,000 still image files. But every one of those 30,000 still image files is checked every month. And that gives me very good confidence. And I have another copy with Amazon anyway, and I have another copy on another computer. So that's how you do it. We had a discussion, I'll just go through this very quickly. We had a discussion with LTWA about which is best. And I think what I really want to say is they all have problems. You have to run this kind of a process whatever your storage is. LTO tape is the dominant form of tape. Hard drives come in various sorts, quite cheap USB up to quite expensive so-called RAID arrays of storage and network attached storage area networks. Tape can jam, tape can misread, and hard drives fail. These are the failure rates of the hard drives used by Google. And Google probably uses more hard drives than anybody. So they publish their failure rates. And they're not very encouraging. You know, not too much in the first year. By the third year, you've had a lot of failures. This is 8% per year. So you're up to 10, 18, you're up to about a quarter of your drives have failed by the third year. That doesn't kill you. If you are doing this, then you're detecting those failures and you're replacing them. And that's what you have to do. You just have to have processes that detect failures and replace them. You replace hard drives, you replace tapes. I think sorry, did I put that again? Yeah. I've got a rule of thumb here that if you have less than 10 terabytes, you're probably better off just using USB hard drives because that's quite cost effective up to 10 terabytes. But absolutely 2 copies on 2 separate devices, absolutely, because you can't run this little model without 2 copies on 2 separate devices. Above something like a petabyte, all the major petabyte installations use tape because it's cheaper and more reliable. In between 10 terabytes and 1 petabyte, there's room for discussion. As far as I'm concerned, I would probably want to be using data tape, certainly when I got to the 100 terabytes. 15 years ago, I didn't know what a terabyte was. This is a strange world. And now we have to, you buy a computer with a terabyte. So you will end up having things like 100 terabytes, I'm sure. And you can manage 100 terabytes on multiple hard drives, but it gets increasingly complicated. And the hard drives, you saw 25% of them fail within 3 years. Data tape does not fail as often. You have to buy a data tape player. You will have failures on data tape, but there will be fewer. And so I would be getting data tape for 100 terabytes. I personally don't have 100 terabytes, so I don't have a data tape player, and I can't tell you that you should also. I want to very quickly go to access and what library collections are for. I mean, traditionally, this is what an archive did. Official records, births, deaths, marriages, property ownership. They extend to historical and cultural collections, so a famous person like the Dalai Lama has a personal archive. And usually it's unique material. Libraries are different. Many of you are librarians, and you should write this slide yourself. You know these things more than I do. I'm an engineer. But Sometimes libraries have legal deposit. So certainly in most European countries, every book that's published has to be sent to the British Library. In some countries, every television program and every radio program and every CD and DVD that's published also have to be sent to a national institution. That doesn't happen in the UK, but there is legal deposit for books and sometimes music and broadcasting. Libraries are where people go. People don't generally go to archives. Researchers go to archives. People go to libraries, and you get access to what's called popular, and scholars and researchers. And audiovisual, well, you preserve it, but if there isn't access and nobody knows about you, then who's going to give you money? Well, no, that's not what I want to say. If you don't have access, you don't provide a service. And who gives you money? That's what I want to say. Digitization supports preservation and access. I tried to, and again, the director said, getting our message to people. Digital objects have properties that analog objects don't have. You can get a digital object from here to London at the speed of light. And that object can be seen in London and in Mumbai and here in Dharamshala simultaneously. So you can be in more than one place at a time. You can travel at the speed of light. Digital objects have magical properties. They violate the laws of physics. Very quickly, and I really will come to Tibetan works and arts as quickly as I can, so I don't want to spend too much about this, but I'm from originally the BBC archive, now retired. I wanted to know what was happening about archiving of audio and video and broadcasting and film in India and here in Tibetan exile. So I've done some research on what is happening and especially what's online, because I was wanting to see what the situation was for access. So the public broadcaster in India does maintain an archive. They do talk about their archive. They don't actually have content online. There is a film archive, and again, they maintain 16,000 films. This is again this business about how many are. This is 2% have been digitized. This is this number that I'm talking about. I hope that these 16,000 films will last for 100 years, because at 2% they're going to need to. Anyway, that's the problem. But there isn't content online. I looked at the National Archive, looked at the National Library. There's a situation in India where you can't access these sites unless you're in India, and that bothered me when I was sitting in London. A lot of other Indian sites. The best one that I found that actually had audio and video online was the Times newspaper, Times of India. So you don't just have to search for Tendulkar, you can search for anything else and see audio and video there. So I've left the commercial, the heritage world and gone to the commercial world to actually find my first online content. Indian Ministry of Culture talks about their oral tradition. They talk about propagating it in a printed form, which bothered me, because to me the oral tradition is something that's you want to hear it, you don't want to just read about the transcript. But there are people there who have recordings. There's an archive of Indian music. There was an article in Business Standard that said there's no National Sound Archive, but it gave details about the archive of Indian music. And they're going to concentrate on old recordings, and then they're going to work with the broadcaster for recordings since 1940. But I could find this online, and they have content online in something called SoundCloud. SoundCloud is a place, it's a bit like YouTube. but more professional, and you can put your sound there, and I recommend that to anyone. It costs you nothing, and then people everywhere can access your content. So that's a very, in my view, a very good thing to do. And All India Radio says they have 17,000 hours. We'll come back to this number 17,000 because that's All India Radio and it has 17,000 hours. Largest library of Indian, okay, the music and spoken world. To me that's a small, well, okay, let's just go on. My professional association is International Association of Sound Archives. This member in India has his own gramophone museum. They put their material on YouTube. They have a YouTube channel. Again, this is free. This is something you can do. And then this is the famous Dr. Shubha Chaudhry for the Center of Ethnomusicology in Delhi, who's had a long association with the LTWA and excellent contact. And they have material that's online at the Center for Ethnomusicology. They are sponsored partly by some American universities, so their material is on the Smithsonian. This is a US institution, and you can look at it, you can listen to it. If you want to download it, you have to pay, and I don't know where that money goes. I think it goes back to them. But this is what I wanted to come to Tibetan audiovisual heritage, because you do have this library, you do have a general website, and you do have 31,500 hours of recorded resources. That's almost double the archives of Indian radio. So that numbers, I told you I like numbers. The number speaks for itself. And you have these photographs. What I'm here to see and to encourage is how much of this 31,500 is digitized, and what the plan is for the next 10 years, or if necessary, a bit longer. But the next 10 years are vital. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good photo.